and the rights. Judiciary and the rights. We have already seen that the judiciary is entrusted with the task of protecting the rights of individuals, and the Constitution provides two ways in which the Supreme Court can remedy the violation of rights. Violation of rights. First, it can restore fundamental rights. First, it can restore fundamental rights by issuing writs of habeas mandamus. And what is the meaning of mandamus? When a person is not doing his duty, he is infringing the rights of the people. When जो person है जो अपनी ड्यूटी नहीं कर रहा है पर दूसरे की ड्यूटी में दखल दे रहा है, so that is called mandamus. The High Court also have the power to issue such writs under the article of 226. If a person is doing this type of aspect, then he can be issued some type of notice under the article of 226 under the part of mandamus. Secondly, the Supreme Court can declare a concerned law as unconstitutional, and therefore non-operational also under the article of under the article of 226, right, and under the article of 13. Then together, suppose some law is not acceptable, then Supreme Court can struck down that particular law under the article of 13. So together, these two provisions of the Constitution establish the Supreme Court as the protector of fundamental rights. Let me tell you one thing, Supreme Court behaves as a protector of the fundamental rights of the citizens. You know, everyone is having same fundamental rights. That's why we are all equal. The Rashtrapati, the President of India, having 6 fundamental rights, and we are also having the 6 fundamental rights. So nobody is having extra fundamental rights. Fundamental rights, they're the मौलिक अधिकार. सबके बराबर हैं, सबके समान हैं. So together, these two provisions of the Constitution establish the Supreme Court as the protector of fundamental rights of the citizen on one hand, and the interpreter of Constitution on the other. Interpretation of the Constitution on the other. So, the Supreme Court as a protector काम करती है किसके fundamental right के. The second of two ways mentioned above involve judicial review. तो ये जो two ways मैंने आपको अभी बताया, I told you just now, they are under the judicial review. Review मतलब किसी चीज को दोबारा देखना. That is called review. Perhaps the most important part of the Supreme Court is the power of judicial review. Supreme Court का सबसे important part कौन सा होता है? Judicial review का होता है. Judicial review means that the power of Supreme Court or High Court to examine the constitutionality of any law, किसी law को, किसी कानून को Constitution के मुताबिक देखना, उसको और या उसमें suppose there is some flaw or some type of unexpected aspect, then they can review it. That is one of the very powerful aspects of the Supreme Court. Supreme Court arrived at conclusion that the law is inconsistent with the provision of the Constitution. यदि कोई law inconsistent है, according to the provision of the Constitution, then that particular law could be struck down. Such a law is declared as unconditional. Such a law is declared as unconditional and inapplicable, and that particular law is inapplicable. Right. So the term judicial review, the term judicial review is nowhere mentioned in the Constitution. Let me tell you one thing, that judicial review कहीं भी Constitution में mention नहीं है. कि basically Constitution के अंदर कि ये they can have judicial review, the Supreme Court has the judicial review, but it is not mentioned in the Constitution. The term judicial review is nowhere mentioned in the Constitution. However, the fact that India has a written Constitution, India is having a written constitution. It's a voluminous constitution. It is the largest constitution in the world. Written constitution, and the Supreme Court can strike down any law. And Supreme Court is very powerful, and it can strike down any type of law that goes against the fundamental right. Which, if it is that law, particular law is goes against the fundamental right, you know, I told you that our Supreme Court is very much particular about the fundamental right. Your fundamental right is very precious for you also, for the court also. They cannot withhold your fundamental right, or someone says that emergency के अंदर भी आपकी fundamental right को खत्म नहीं किया जा सकता. So goes against fundamental right. Implicity gives the Supreme Court the power of judicial review. And something happens to the fundamental right, then Supreme Court can go for the judicial review. Besides, as we saw in the section, one jurisdiction of the Supreme Court in the case of federal relation to. What do you mean by federal relation? Look, India is a big country, and we have 29 states, 7 million territories. We have got central law, central power. We have got the state power. We have got the local power. We have got the panchayat. So ये power का जो division होता है, that is called federal structure. Besides, we saw this section of jurisdiction as a Supreme Court in the case of federal relation to. The Supreme Court can use the review powers in a law if that law is particularly inconsistent. If the law is inconsistent with the distribution of powers, laid down by the Constitution. Suppose the central government makes a law which, according to the state, concerns a subject from the state. Suppose if central government एक law बनाती है, that particular law is concerned for the state, and central government is unacceptably varying in the law of the state law that is meant for the state law. Then what to do? Then state can go to directly to the approach to the Supreme Court. So suppose the central government makes a law which, according to some states, concern a subject from the state list, then the state can go to the Supreme Court, and if the court agrees with them, it would declare that the law is unconstitutional. और यदि इस बहस के बाद, debate के बाद, discussion के बाद, if Supreme Court finds that a particular law is unacceptable, unconstitutional, then Supreme Court can strike down that particular law. In this sense, the review of the power, Supreme Court includes the power. So this is the power to review. This is the power to review which Supreme Court or High Court can do it. Power to review legislation on the ground that violate fundamental rights. So on the legislation, and they cannot violate the fundamental. Supreme Court, I told you, the Supreme Court is the protector of the fundamental right. Or on the ground that they violate the fundamental distribution of power. So fundamental distribution of power. These are the distribution of power is there. The review power extends to the laws passed by the state legislatures also. State legislature is power. They use this power also. Together, the writ powers and the review powers of the court make judiciary very powerful. Underline the sentence. Together, the writ powers and the review powers make judiciary very powerful. कौन से power? Review power और writ power. Number 1 writ power, number 2 review power. ये दो power जो मिलकर Supreme Court, they make the Supreme Court very powerful. In particular, the review power means that the judiciary can interpret the Constitution and the laws passed by the legislature. Judiciary can interpret the Constitution. Judiciary can interpret the Constitution and the laws passed by the legislature. It means the judiciary जो है Constitution के अंदर interpret कर सकती है, दखल अंदाजी कर सकती है, और किसके ऊपर? कोई कानून यदि किसी fundamental right के against बना हो. and the laws passed by the legislature, जिसे legislative laws को pass करते हैं. Many people think that this feature enables the judiciary to protect the constitution effectively. बहुत सारे लोग ये सोचते हैं कि ये जो पावर मिला है ना कि रिट पास और रिव्यू पास, इससे सुप्रीम कोर्ट इज बीइंग वेरी पावरफुल एंड दे कैन प्रोटेक्ट द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन इफेक्टिवली. They can protect the constitution effectively and also to protect the rights of citizens. So I told you that rights of citizens are very important. So they can protect the rights of the citizens. So the practice of entertaining PIL, public interest litigation, right, has further added to the powers of the judiciary in protecting the rights of the citizen. So PIL ने basically आपके हमारे rights को protect करने का एक साधन बना दिया है. Public के interest में litigation को जारी करना, right? And then there is a debate and discussion on a particular law that makes judiciary very powerful, and nobody can hamper, nobody can interfere in the fundamental rights of the citizen. And these rights are very very much accepted, protected by the law. Do we remember that in the chapter rights we mentioned the rights against exploitation, and now one right is against exploitation. Let me tell you one thing. Many laws, many articles, it has been accepted by other countries also. South Africa, they accepted that PIL, to put PIL in the Supreme Court is a fundamental right of anyone. PIL accepted by the South Africa also. We basically introduced PIL. Indian Constitution introduced PIL. So many countries, they follow the Indian Constitution's law. And one of the major country is South African country. That also says that PIL is very important to protect the law of a citizen, to protect the fundamental right of a citizen, and that just make the review and petitions are basically, they make Supreme Court are very powerful. Do you remember that in chapter on the rights we mentioned the rights against exploitation? What do you mean by this right? This right prohibits forced labor. You know, हमारे देश में forced labor. I mean, हिंदी में इसे कहते हैं बेगारी. Hindi we call it begari. So this right prohibits forced labor, trade in human flesh. लोगों का खरीद फरोख्त करना, लोगों को बेचा जाता है. Right? Young boys and girls, they are being sold out in the market even. Right? And prohibits employment of children in hazardous jobs. छोटे बच्चों को खतरनाक कामों के लिए हम उन्हें एम्प्लॉय नहीं कर सकते. बच्चों को भी एम्प्लॉय नहीं कर सकते. So, and employment children is hazardous, but the question is, how could those whose rights were violated approach them? अब सचमुच यदि किसी के वायलेशन हुई है उनके राइट्स के साथ, तो वो किस तरीके से कोर्ट को अप्रोच करेगा? कोर्ट को कैसे अप्रोच करेगा? कोर्ट को he can approach through the PIL and judicial activism made it possible for the courts to consider these violations. There was the PIL and judicial activism. Judicial activism means when the judiciary is activated, right? They can make this possible that a person can directly approach to the Supreme Court. Let me tell you one thing. If a person's fundamental right has been violated, he don't have to go to the lower courts, right? He can directly approach to the Supreme Court. Thus, the court considered a whole set of cases. And let me tell you one thing. Some another example was this blinding of the inmates of the jail. लोगों को भागलपुर के अंदर जेल में के कैदियों को अंधा कर दिया गया था. Then court was there to protect them by the police, and human working condition, police torture. So the sexual exploitation of the children, and so on. This trend has made rights really meaningful, the PIL, for the poor and the disadvantaged section. So this all are very important. PIL is very important, writ is very important, and our review power is very important. So judiciary is very powerful, Supreme Court is very powerful. This Supreme Court is there to protect the human rights, protect the fundamental rights, and so many writs are there, many PILs are there, which make that no one can hamper our fundamental rights. That is there. Next, in the next video. That is now, do we remember that in the chapter on rights, so we mentioned the rights against exploitation? This right prohibits forced labor, trade in human flesh, and prohibits the employment of children. So this is hazardous. So I told you earlier also that we cannot do inhuman things. We cannot trade in human flesh. We cannot employ children in the hazardous circumstances. So these were and a person, if it has happened, then a person can go to the PIL. So then is judiciary and the parliament. Now judiciary and the parliament. So apart from taking a very active stand on the matter of right, the court has been active in seeking to prevent subversion of the constitution. What do you mean by subversion? It is the meaning of destruction. Subversion of the constitution through political practice, thus areas that were considered beyond the scope of the judicial review, such as the powers of the president and the governors, were brought under purview of the courts. It means कि president के power को भी court देखता है कि what type of powers has been given to the president, and some governors and other people, high authority people, how much the power they are having. Court is watching. That's why sometimes it's said that court is behave like a watchdog. There are many other instances in which the Supreme Court actively involved itself in the administration of the justice by giving the direction to the executive agencies. Thus, it gave direction to the CBI, initiate investigation against the politicians and bureaucrats in the Hawala case. Sometimes we say that politicians are very powerful. Nobody can check the politicians. But let me tell you one thing. In India, Prime Minister, earlier Prime Minister, ex-Prime Minister, Mr. Narasimha Rao, he has been summoned by the court. He was summoned by the court, right? And he has to tell. It is said that he gave illegal allotment to the allotment of the petrol pumps. So the Narasimha Rao case, illegal allotment, the Narasimha Rao case, illegal allotment of petrol pumps, and Hawala case, etc. Hawala case also, etc. They were against the Prime Minister, ex-Prime Minister, Mr. Narasimha Rao. So we may have heard about some of these cases. Many of these instances are the products of judicial activism. They are the judicial activism. When judiciary is very much activate. So the Indian Constitution is based on a delicate principles of limited separation of powers and checks and balances. Principle limited separation of powers and checks and balances. This means that each organ of the government has a clear area of functioning. हर एक government का अपना एक function होता है, अपना एक clear functioning होती है, right? That clear functioning is clear functioning of the government, and they cannot interfere in any other's area. So that clear cut, judiciary cannot interfere Frequently in other matter, legislatures also there, executive are there, legislature they make the laws, executive they execute the laws, and judiciary behave like a watchdog so that nobody can break the law. Next in next video. Till then, thank you.